Willkommen in Duisburg. Das ist der beste Ort, heute in Deutschland zu sein. Okay, there we go. Dieser Vortrag ist in English, or is it, as it is soon to be renamed, Brexitlish. This is what we have. You have to learn a whole new language of bullshit. So, I'm Andy Clarke. I'm going to talk about art direction for the web today. I've actually written a book which is coincidentally called Art Direction for the Web. But what I want to talk about is bigger than a book. It's about improving what we make for the web, whatever that might be. Now, just a quick kind of content warning. I'm going to show some examples which contain images of violence, which is probably going to make you uncomfortable. But that's the point of art direction. Sometimes. I will give away a free copy of this book to anybody in the room who is wearing a Motorhead t-shirt. If you are, stand up. What is that? Is that? Oh, okay. It's not Lemmy's Lounge in the Rainbow in LA. No, that's close enough though. Close enough. It has the war pig on there. I might actually have to mug you for that T-shirt. This could be cool. This is the first of 2 sessions. There is a special prize for anybody that makes it all the way through to the end of the second session. I won't tell you what that is just yet, but hang in there. This is going to be good. The first hour, I want to concentrate more on kind of design-related issues, and in the second part after the break, I'm actually going to delve into a little bit of CSS and HTML. Nothing too complicated for the designers in the room that just want to kind of work with Bezier curves. But it should be interesting, showing us how we can implement the kind of designs that are going to improve the look and feel of the web as we know it. So I just want to start off with a quote from advertising legend Bill Bernbach. Bernbach was responsible for one of the most iconic ad campaigns of the 20th century. He worked with Volkswagen of America to launch the VW Beetle in the 1960s. And, we hear a lot now about, data and research and usability studies and all this kind of nonsense. I love this quote from Bernbach. He said, "The truth isn't the truth until people believe you. And they can't believe you if they don't know what you're saying. And they can't know what you're saying if they don't listen. And they won't listen if you're not interesting. And you won't be interesting unless you say things imaginatively, originally, or freshly." And I think this is really important. Because whatever it is that we are making, there is a message that we want people to listen to. It could be read my content, buy my product, sign up for my website, whatever it might be. So we need to be presenting this in fresh, original, imaginative ways. So I just want you to study these 2 news stories for a second. I'm gonna wait. I fought the law and the law won. Right. These are 2 examples of art directing a news story. It was about the US DEA's longest-running drug cartel case. And these pages contain pretty much the same written copy and many of the same photographs. The one on the left is from the Atlantic, and the information there is presented in this way, which is intentionally matter-of-fact, because they want the reader to feel that the Atlantic is balanced and reliable. Whereas over on the right, this is from ProPublica, and they've used illustrations which convey this violence in a way which is really powerful, but it would have been very difficult to stomach if they'd used photography. So these illustrations they make people feel tense. You know, they make people feel uncomfortable and terrified, and you know, that's okay. Because people should feel emotions like that when they're reading about shootouts and melting drug dealers in barrels of acid. We've all seen Breaking Bad, right? Now, the process of evoking these feelings is called art direction. And these two stories were art directed with two very different goals in mind. And the design decisions that were taken depend on factors that I'm going to show you over the next hour. So what does art direction mean? One interpretation of mine is that art direction uses design techniques to intentionally evoke an emotional response from someone when they're reading an article or using a product or visiting a website. So when they were art directing their version of this drug cartel story, ProPublica chose a more dramatic direction because they wanted people to feel uncomfortable while they were reading it. And they used these illustrations from Tim McDonough, chaos and violence and death, to help stimulate those emotions and shift people up the emotional scale from just being interested to being appalled about what's happening. And people pay attention to powerfully art-directed stories. You know, they really get noticed. An unbelievable story of rape, which is also from ProPublica, won a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. It's also the subject of a new Netflix drama called Unbelievable. And this story is even more notable because it was written by two different journalists, and one was reporting from the woman's perspective and the other from that of the police. But instead of merging those two voices together, the editor kept them separate. And the art director, David Slate, recognized that there were these two timelines and these alternating voices that made the story much more powerful. So he emphasized that through his design decisions. So the woman's story uses these specially commissioned illustrations, but the police story includes photography. Her story is on the left half of the page, and theirs is on the right. And the elements that are common to both, like the introduction and the epilogue, are in the center. And this is a compelling story which is told much more emotively because of its art direction. Now, I realize that not everybody designs news stories. You know, some of us help charities to raise money, some of us work for governments, where the aim is to inform people, or in the case of the British government, to lie to them. Some of us design digital products. We focus on the experience of using them. And stimulating pleasure in buying or using a product through design is also art direction. You know, creating positive experiences by stirring emotions and then motivating people. That's also art direction. Dan Maul said, art direction brings clarity and definition to our work. It helps our work convey a specific message to a particular group of people. Art direction combines art and design to evoke a cultural and, this is important, an emotional reaction. And without art direction, we're left with dry, sterile experiences that are easily forgotten. So if you're anything like me, whether you're working on a product or a website, or you're designing email newsletters or login screens or notifications or an onboarding process, the last thing that you want is people to feel that your designs are dry and sterile and forgotten. And art direction can help that prevent that from happening. One of my favorite characters in the advertising game, Sir John Hegarty, said, data is great at giving you information, giving you knowledge, but it doesn't give you understanding. And that's its great failing. What we need is greater creativity. I love this quote. I don't love the fact that I missed that widow on the end of the quote. I shall be fixing that later. Don't take a photograph of my widow. You can't. That's going to be there forever on the internet now. I shall be publicly shamed for the rest of my career if you tweet that picture of that terrible typographic faux pas. Don't do this. Don't do this to me. Now, to help me describe how to art direct designs for products and websites, I made this. I made Wheelman, which is an app for booking a fast car and a getaway driver once you've done a robbery. And I also made a companion website which is full of advice on how to get away clean. And this Wheelman website also tells readers about some of the infamous London criminals and gangsters of the 1960s and the murders and the robberies and the violence they committed. Me being me, I had to have all of the content on these examples to be accurate. So my wife actually did all the research. She searched how to get a fake passport, which countries in the world don't have extradition treaties with the EU, how to torch a car, how to take on a false identity. She was really worried about her search results at one point. She said to me, I'm Googling how to get a fake passport, and I keep seeing these onion links. What are they? Okay, don't go there. Stick to DuckDuckGo. So, people who work on the web tend to come from lots of different backgrounds. Not everybody who designs products or websites went to graphic design school or got taught how to choose or why to choose one grid instead of another. And the same is also true of design principles like symmetry and asymmetry and contrast and scale and all those kind of things. How many people here went to art school or studied graphic design? 5. Oh, including you. I let you off. You're okay now. You're forgiven for recording my typographic catastrophe. So these are not new principles. These are the principles that have guided art direction and design for decades. And they matter just as much to the world of digital products and websites as they do to glossy pages in a magazine. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes just explaining some of these principles and showing the impact that they can have on products and websites. I'm going to start by talking about balance. So, why does balance matter? Well, a balanced design helps people to feel comfortable. And for a composition to be balanced symmetrically, there needs to be an equal amount of visual weight on both sides of a central axis. And those axes can be horizontal or vertical or even diagonal. So both these circles are the same weight, have the same size, and they've got identical visual weight. Likewise, these following two compositions are balanced symmetrically, this time across this vertical axis. And the circles are symmetrical because I place them at equal distances from that central axis. Now, the two sides of this next composition don't mirror each other because they're obviously composed differently. Excuse me. But the composition still has equal visual weight, so the overall layout feels balanced. We have a large thing on one side and then lots of small things on the other to balance it out. And we can create asymmetry by arranging elements so that there appears to be no relationship between them, or on one side of an axis carrying more visual weight than another. So one circle isn't just bigger here, it actually crosses this line of symmetry. And this can make people kind of feel a little uncomfortable, take notice. It kind of draws them out of their comfort zone and, makes them pay attention. And sometimes it doesn't seem like there's any relationship between color or shape or size or even the amount of white space. But this actually makes designs feel like they're really full of energy. Now, back in the 1960s, when I was born, I love this Contao Konferenz because I'm not the oldest person in the room. This is fantastic. There were two rival gangs that fought for control of the London criminal underworld. There were the Krays in the north, and then the Richardsons who were south of the river. So in this next design I'm going to show you, this horizontal axis cuts the layout in two, just like the Thames cuts London in two. Now, these two gangs were really bitter rivals, but the overall composition here feels kind of harmonious because both sides of the river have got this equal visual weight and the content is kind of almost symmetrical. Now, the images and text describing these two gangs are weighted about equally, and there's symmetry that suggests this equality between them. So although I can arrange these items differently for a small screen, I'm able to kind of maintain that balance. Now, while it's not kind of explicit in this next article, the Krays were really dominant in the criminal underworld in the 1960s, so it's really important that the design reflects this in some way. So we might do that, for example, by changing visual weight on the north part of the layout, maybe by increasing the headline size or the image sizes. Now, the first of these two designs is pretty close to pure symmetry. We pull the alignment of both of these commons towards this vertical axis, and then we put the images on the opposite sides. But, one downside of a symmetrical design is that it can feel static and predictable, which is not at all what we want to convey when we're designing something about some criminal gangs. It's not going to keep people engaged for very long. So we can create movement and energy by using an asymmetric design. And this is going to hold people's attention for much longer, and it conveys the imbalance between these two gangs. Now, I see designs that are based on horizontal and vertical axes every day, but you hardly ever see anything which is based on a diagonal. Every once in a while, you might find people that have been really cheeky and daring, and they might have put like a slanted edge bottom to a big hero graphic. But it's hardly ever essential to the communication of the design. Now, we know that the dynamic nature of a digital canvas makes pure diagonal symmetry pretty much impossible. But that doesn't mean that we can't use diagonals, because they're really useful for encouraging the eye and leading it down towards where we wanted them to focus. So the diagonal in this design draws the eye from the upper left down to the lower right. And if we add extra visual weight at the top, we reinforce the dominance that the Crays had over the Richardsons. And the results can be even more compelling when we combine diagonals with a change in scale. And because the weight of this headline and the space around it balance this full high image, there's not a lot of tension in this design. This is Mad Frankie Fraser, by the way, who spent 42 years at various times in British jails. Strangely, later on in life, became a very popular game show participant. Was on lots of game shows later in life. Now, if we contrast the large image with a small headline, what we do is we make this composition kind of intentionally unsettling. It's not something that we would expect. You can see the difference between the two, right? And scale is something that we really should play with and use more. Now, a design is said to have radial balance when elements radiate out from a central point. And this can be particularly effective when content is really graphical, because it focuses attention down onto particular areas. And there are other forms of radial balance too. Now, Ronnie and Reggie were at the center of 1960s gangland activity. So that's the kind of message that we want to demonstrate through this design. So the twins stayed dead center while all of their criminal associates all radiate from them. And radial balance can create really stylish navigation elements, and a radial navigation menu ties in really beautifully with the branding on my Wheelman website. Links wrap around either side of the circular logo. We used to see things like this years ago. Do you remember like the first Microsoft homepage? Had something pretty similar to that. I kind of miss those days when we played around with stuff more. And when you're holding your phone in your right hand, you might use this navigation to make it easier to reach. Or you could do the opposite for right-handed people. Luke Wroblewski has done lots of writing about this. And it keeps the most important links within reach, so we can arrange them in these bands that radiate out from the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Now, controlling flow is one way of leading someone's eye around a composition. It lets people know where to start and then guides them from one part to another in the direction that we want them to travel. And if we want to get flow correct, we have to think really hard about our content structure and what we want people to do first and then second and then later. So using things like bold headlines and dominant images to guide the reader can be really, really interesting. And their visual weight will draw someone's attention towards this focal point. And then we use lines and text blocks and other direction cues to let people know the direction that we want their eye to travel. So I combined the visual weight of this headline and the image to draw attention right up into that top left corner. And then we've got this series of repeating text blocks which lead the reader across the page. And I'm using a line here at the bottom of this content block to reinforce that horizontal reading direction and let people know that they need to scan from left to right. And I'm putting it at the bottom of my copy rather than at the top so that it doesn't get in the way of that white space at the top of the page. Now, if I want to interrupt that movement, interrupt that flow, perhaps because we've got two different areas of content on the same page, then I can use this vertical line which forms a barrier, which reinforces the fact that these areas have two different types of content. Now, one narrow column of running text makes this vertical flow in this design really visible. But there's this other design which other detail which gives this composition energy. Now, by matching the visual weight of the headline and the image and placing them at opposite ends of that column of copy, what I do is I create this dynamic diagonal. And then both of these examples previously just had one direction. But if we include two directions, we can help people understand perhaps the structure of a complex page. So this one tells two stories. We've got one about the Richardsons, which is told along this horizontal axis, and another about Frankie Fraser, who is a member of their firm, and that's conveyed down in this center column. Now, people could find a layout like this really confusing, so we can provide obvious focal points and visual cues to avoid them being confused. We've got this dominant header at the focal point of the top of the text. And I'm pulling that whole column up into the white space and setting that in a darker, medium weight sans serif typeface, which emphasizes the contrast between these two stories. Now, they were famous for their kind of violent confrontations, but Ronnie and Reggie were inseparable until they were both sentenced to 30 years in different prisons. And then they spent the rest of their lives in prison. Reggie was actually released on compassionate grounds after serving more than his 30-year sentence. So balance creates harmony, contrast adds tension. So this layout brings those twins face to face to portray the closeness of their relationship. And we've got these solid columns of running text and this vertical headline which forms this solid unit which represents their bond. And small details make a really big difference. We can place these little arrows above each column of text to point towards either the center of the composition or, in the case of a small screen or mobile, pointing down. Now, if we look at this edited version of that photo, where the twins are looking apart, kind of makes people feel uncomfortable because they're facing now in different directions. So to really kind of emphasize that tension, I'm going to take my vertical headline and move it onto the left-hand side of the page, which leaves this void between the two people. And then I can also reverse the direction of those arrows, which now they point in opposite directions. And then on a smaller screen, to maintain this tension, I can then split those twins up into 2 different photos. And it was their own actions that brought about their downfall, but it was also Detective Nipper Reid of Scotland Yard. Actually, I've managed to get through this whole talk so far without doing my fake Cockney gangster accent, which is quite good. I might actually try and do the rest of the whole talk like Mad Frankie Fraser. That's going to go down well in Duisburg, isn't it? So what I'm doing is I'm placing Nipper in the middle. I can't do it. I can't do it forever. At the center of this layout, and then I'm using a larger sans serif typeface for his story, and then a serif typeface for theirs, which emphasizes the difference between them. You can see that here. And then we can do some really interesting things, both with typography and with CSS Grid. Some elements stand out because they're much bigger, others because they're much smaller. So, placing something large at the top of the page to either balance or contrast visual weight can really dial up the interest. And scale is incredibly important. Whatever it is that we're designing, whether it be a shopping cart or a login screen or an editorial piece of information, news story. So I'm just going to talk about scale just a little bit. There's something about these images which feels wrong. That has to be the ugliest baby ever, doesn't it? I shouldn't really say that. Everybody's got to be nice about babies. I think all babies look like Winston Churchill. I mean, I like babies, but I couldn't eat a whole one. Always. That might be a step too far. Now, something feels wrong about this. Maybe it's because we know that minis are usually larger than babies. So are we looking at a really massive baby, or are we looking at a toy car? I don't know. Maybe a mini is bigger than an elephant. I don't know. It wasn't the last time I checked. Even though they're now made in Germany, and they seem to have grown, since they're not very mini anymore, minis, are they? They now weigh about 3 tons. But if we're telling a story about how spacious a mini really is on the inside, then messages like this can be more important than the reality of whether you can actually fit any elephants into a mini. So making an element large to let people know that it's important will attract attention. And it also creates this visual hierarchy which helps people understand the order and the structure of your content. And we can't just make everything big on its own. If we're going to make something have a significant impact, then we need to balance that size with the large size with the size of other elements. So I might contrast the size of this Mini Cooper with the smaller than average text about it. And I know some clients are going to go, yeah, but look at all that white space. We could fill that with advertising. So the images of these 2 cars are identical, but the impact that the one on the left makes is less because the image and the running text are pretty much the same size, whereas on the right, I can make the mini appear much bigger, more significant, by reducing the amount and the size of that text. And then when space is really limited, like on a phone screen, I can use a different image. I still want to maintain that hierarchy. So I might use a different image of the side of the mini and have people be able to to scroll across it. So this mini here is making far more impact than its size might suggest. This actually reminds me of Bill Bernbach's Think Small and Lemon campaigns for VW of America. And then small is really beautiful. You know, even on the size of a phone in your hand, you can really use scale to emphasize the meaning behind content. So it's really important with all of these techniques to focus people on the most important parts of a composition. And we can borrow rules from photography, for example. So this principle here, the rule of thirds, basically involves dividing a layout into 9 segments by drawing 2 horizontal and 2 vertical lines. And then the composition focal points are where these lines meet. What use is that? Well, it's the intersections of those lines that are the focal points, and I can use them to actually position the headline and the center of the front of this mini's bonnet to draw the eye towards those focal points and that important information. And these can be equally useful in portrait orientations, you know, iPads, for example. And if we have a little imagination, we can use them to inspire some very different and unusual designs. So the focal points are where these 4 lines intersect, and what I'm doing is I'm placing my headline and then both of these images onto those focal points to create what is an uncommon layout, let's say, unusual. Now, despite having a name like an Italian mobster, Fibonacci was actually a mathematician from the early Renaissance. He was famous for not his ice cream, as I once thought, but for his number sequence and this Fibonacci spiral. And designers have got lots of reasons to be inspired or fascinated by Fibonacci sequence because it's pretty close to the golden ratio, and it's inspired artists and architects for hundreds of years. You know, you've probably seen this spiral overlaid onto everything from, I don't know, Twitter's logo to Donald Trump's improbable comb-over. So we've probably seen it expressed as a spiral, but it's the numbers that are much more important, much more useful. So this makes it very easy to determine the proportions which are visually appealing for everything from font sizes to gutters and margins and, you know, the structure of the whole page. So if you overlay a Fibonacci spiral over a grid made up of squares, you get something like this. And these squares are perfectly proportioned, and they can offer enormous flexibility for making designs where the relationships between the elements feel really natural, really balanced. And we can use as many squares as we want. We can arrange them in any combination that you can think of. It's just a very different way of working with a grid online. So I might use 2 of the largest squares to define the size of the photographs of the mini front and rear. And then copy is going to fit pretty neatly into these squares alongside. And it needn't be confined to a single square. I can use this L-shape combination of 3 squares to determine the composition of the Mini Cooper headline. And then we don't need to lose the playfulness just because there's less screen space available on smaller screens. I don't buy this argument that, you know, just because somebody's looking at a website on a phone, everything has to be in a single column. That's just laziness. In fact, you know, if we're working on a small screen, a playful design can really engage people. So for this mini design, I'm going to reposition those same elements into different squares to give me this kind of unusual spaces for my content. And grids have had this long and varied history in design, from early books through movements like constructivism to what we now call the international typographics style, or Swiss style, right up to the present day popularity of frameworks like Bootstrap and material design. When you imagine a Bootstrap or something similar based on it, what do you imagine? What are the first things when I mention Bootstrap that comes to mind, right? We've got centered headings. 4 columns with icons above. And, of course, a full-width image, or in Bootstrap parlance, I think they call it a jumbotron. Every website looks like this. The web is now so full of jumbotron-style images that people just come to expect them. I've had clients basically saying, aren't we going to have a big horizontal image on the homepage? As if kind of that's, every website must have one. There's nothing wrong with photos that fill a screen. They can have this really dramatic effect. But we need to contrast drama with a form of calmness if it's going to be effective. If every website shouts, "Look at me," then people just stop listening. So when we want to use images to add drama, we need to make sure that their effect is as effective on small screens as well as large ones. I see a lot of people do this. They waste a great picture just by squeezing it down onto a small screen. Shrinking an image to fit a phone screen, particularly a landscape image like this, is going to decrease its visual weight and therefore the impact that it makes. And that's why we should always consider altering a picture's aspect ratio and cropping it carefully to get the most from it. So, on the left, we've got this shrunken, but otherwise unchanged image, which has lost the intensity. And the right has an aspect ratio which has a better fit, but the crop, again, is reducing the impact that this image has on a small screen. But when I change the aspect ratio and recrop the image, then it's preserving the influence that I want this image to have over my design. The reason why I included Amy Johnson, by the way, she was the first woman to fly non-stop from the UK to Australia. And when I was researching private airports to get away after making a robbery, one of the airports was Croydon Airport in the south of London. Croydon Airport was London's first airport, and that's where Amy Johnson took off from. And I included this because Croydon Airport is now IKEA, and of course there's no escape when you go into IKEA. So cropping photos to make the most of them is really, really crucial. It's also something that very few people do. It makes a massive difference to someone's perception of a design across different screen sizes. It just doesn't get the attention that it needs. Full-width photographs are not the only option when you want to make a big impression. Images can occupy the entire viewport height, as well as the width. Page-filling pictures like this are really common in print, but we don't see them used that frequently on the web. I think this is going to change now, because we've got grid layout properties and viewport-based units and things like object fit and object position in CSS, which make these things a lot more practical. So the margin, which is around this large image kind of acts as a visual boundary which stops the eye from moving outside. And leaving empty margins between the grid and the viewport is really, really common. It kind of reinforces page structure, but it can also make a design just feel rather predictable. Whereas images which bleed across one or more margins off the left or the top or the bottom or the right of a page basically allows the eye to flow off the page, and it kind of hints that there's more to see outside the viewport, which adds to the sense of mystery or maybe adventure in a design. We can see a similar result on medium and on small screens. I'm just going to expand the width of these images sometimes to actually include the gutter width. And I can preserve the aspect ratio while allowing this image to bleed off across margins and gutters. And then tight cropping helps to make this photograph maintain the intensity on small screens. Now, Amy Johnson actually died after bailing out of a plane in 1941. Her body was actually never recovered. So, I want this design to reflect her tragic death. So, for extra impact, I want to allow this image to spread across the entire page and fade it into the background. And when there's no boundaries, your eye is free to roam around anywhere and in any direction. And this creates this incredible feeling of space. But you've got to be careful, because with this freedom, it's essential that we have an amount of structure. For example, with these solid blocks of quite unusually justified running text. And this width of this headline here, it emphasizes the two columns of text because it spans across both of them. But it's also this kind of ideal counterpoint to the large image over on the right. And when we use images as focal points, we often need to find ways to balance their visual weight so that they don't overwhelm the content. So we might have running text here combined with a lot of white, or in this case black, space, which perfectly balances the scale of the image over on the right-hand side. And directing how people's eyes move isn't an exact science. We can't force people to follow any particular path that we set for them, particularly on such a diverse range of screen sizes. But we can influence people through where we position things like images by bleeding them off the top of the page. This tall image, really tightly cropped, directs the eye down through my content. And small areas offer plenty ways to get creative with big screen-filling images. So instead of scrolling past a great big image like this, consider actually overlaying it over the top of content, and then people can swipe it out of the way. And I don't see designs often that just have one picture. So learning how to arrange multiple images on a page so that compositions feel balanced is really important. So we can organize the same size photos at regular intervals to create a rhythm which can play throughout the design. And it's this cadence which makes a design flow, and it carries people along with it. And people very quickly tune in to a visual rhythm. So for my design of this timeline, I'm using a modular grid which helps create these repeating patterns in the content. And this consistency brings individual pieces of content together, and then it makes it clear that they're part of this greater whole or composition. And the visual weight here of the dates balances the photos that go below them. Images that are significantly larger or interrupt the rhythm, they create this kind of offbeat feel, and people are almost unconsciously drawn towards them. So we need to put that knowledge to good use. Use differently sized images which emphasize the most important, the most critical content. And to maintain balance on a visual weight on small screens, we should consider using images that are often wider than the actual viewport, and then allow people to scroll horizontally to see what's hidden. And you could be forgiven for thinking that just filling a screen with one photo means throwing out the grid. But it needn't mean that at all. In fact, modular grids can provide the dimensions for large images and also for their captions. So when you want people to slow down and really take notice of what you're saying, then use a large image. And then we can step up the pace by arranging smaller photographs in this 1-2-2-1-2 pattern from a compound grid. And in the past, blurring photos was something that we could only really do in Photoshop, but we've got CSS now that can help us create these illusions of depth by applying blurs. And one aspect of print design that I always wished was more easily achievable on the web was wrapping text around irregular shaped images. For years I used to come up with hacks in HTML and CSS to kind of try to replicate some of these print layouts. But I don't need to struggle with hacks anymore because we've got clip paths and we've got CSS shapes, which can make those designs a reality. And while these straight edges of images and text columns communicate a formal feel, when we have organically shaped photographs and copy which is set inside fluid columns, we can create a design which feels really friendly and informal. Organic shapes, they really add movement, which draws people to them, and we can connect an audience with a story. These lovely big numerals here are, they're almost too beautiful to hide. But they're also perfect for carving shapes into columns of text. We can almost sculpt columns into spectacular shapes using CSS shapes. So in the style of Alexey Brodovitch and his work in Harper's Bazaar, which I'm going to talk a little bit about after the break. When I remove the fill from those numbers, I'm left with these two really unusually shaped columns of running text. And then the right-hand column here of text echoes the outline of Amy Johnson's portrait over on the left-hand side. And in the previous example, both of those visible areas acted as shapes. But there are times when we might want to flow content around a shape that's different from what's visible. So we can use alpha channels, mask images, that the browser can then extract to form a shape. It's common to see content flowing around shapes in print design, but this was impossible before. On the web before CSS shapes. So, what good is art direction for the web if we don't have the layout tools and the technologies to actually get the results that we're aiming for? Well, guess what? We do. We've got CSS Grid and Flexbox. They're the best layout systems for the web so far, and they're perfect for developing art direction at different screen sizes. We've got massive libraries of typefaces. We've got newer technologies like variable fonts to set type. We've got clip path and shape outside, and they give us countless opportunities to use art direction to capture someone's attention and then keep them really engaged. So I'm really excited about all this stuff. Probably more excited than I should be for a man of my advancing years. But if you make websites for businesses or for charities or governments or news outlets and you want to tell that story more effectively, we've got everything that we need to make great art direction for the web. And I think that art direction should be as much a part of product and website designers' accessibility and performance, and it needn't be someone else's job. Just like accessibility and performance, it can be part of everything that you do day to day. Yeah, it takes a good eye, but you can teach that. It takes a lot of practice, but, you know, no more than learning anything else in terms of web design or development. So, thank you for listening. There is the book, which I need to promote. And there's also a video course that I made for Skillshare and Vimeo, which you can get 50% off with the code Ace of Spades. Danke, and I will see you after the break.